Okay, so welcome everyone. Just going to give it another minute or so for everyone to make their way in. Okay. And so I think we will make a start. So a very warm welcome to this webinar on behalf of the OU Islamophobia Working Group and the OU Palestine Solidarity Group. The title of this webinar is Islamophobia and the Palestine Exception. So for context, Islamophobia Awareness Month takes place every November with the aim of highlighting experiences of Islamophobia, and the theme for 2024 is Seeds of Change. In the wake of the UK riots and the rise of more widely accepted examples of Islamophobia across mainstream media and the political rhetoric, this year is a pertinent time to recognise the very real, damaging effects of such a prevalent discourse. It is in this vein that this webinar has been arranged, and we are fortunate to be joined by two wonderful experts. We have Salman Saeed, Professor of Rhetoric and Decolonial Thought at the University of Leeds and pioneer of critical Muslim studies, and he is joined by Chella Ward, Lecturer in Classical Studies at the Open University. Chella will converse with Salman for the first part of the webinar, and they will address questions from the Q&A section in the latter part of the event. So to ask a question, please go to the right-hand side of the MS Teams chat and choose question from the drop-down list. If we do get a lot of questions, we will need to be selective, so apologies in advance if your question is not addressed. You can like other people's questions too, if you'd like them answered. In terms of our code of conduct, I've put this into the Q&A section already, but just to be clear, we request that everyone uses respectful language. We will not accept any form of discrimination or harassment, whether based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, beliefs, age, disability, religion, or lack thereof, or socioeconomic background. And we encourage anyone who has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment during this webinar to alert us. So now I will hand over to Dr. Chella Ward. Thank you all very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Farnaz, for that introduction, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm going to start by saying assalamu alaikum to everyone. Assalamu alaikum, Salman. Thank you so much for giving us your time and joining us for this conversation. I thought that what we would do today, as Farnaz has already explained, the title today is Islamophobia and the Palestine Exception. So it's in a sense a webinar that is going to talk about those two things, but also bring those two things together. And we're going to do this in the form of a very informal conversation. So we invite you also to ask your questions. We'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes between the two of us, and then we'll turn to your questions in the Q&A box. So you're welcome at any time to use the Q&A box to put your questions in. So let's start with this term Islamophobia, first of all. I'm wondering, Salman, whether you might be able to start by giving us some examples of what Islamophobia is. If someone had come to this webinar thinking, I don't really know what this is, I've sort of heard the term, but I couldn't really identify it. What would you say Islamophobia is? How could we give some examples of it that we might then be able to kind of pull together the family resemblances from and begin to think about a definition?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for all the everyone who's come to this webinar. I guess one of the issues about terms like Islamophobia and terms before it like racism or terms like anti-Semitism was that when the terms began to circulate, there was always a certain kind of feigned ignorance about what they could mean and how complicated it could be, etc. So one way of thinking about Islamophobia, if anyone doesn't know anything about it or is concerned about it, would be to simply think of it as a type of racism. And we can say this after 50 years of anti-racist work in this country and elsewhere and anti-colonial work. So if we were holding this 50 years ago, we would be having a similar question: what racism is, what does it mean? Can I say blah? Can I order black coffee? And all these kinds of real issues that used to go on. So I think the first point would be to, if not to get bogged down in trying to understand works by working out the etymology. The etymology of words just tells you about it tells you their history. It doesn't actually tell you what the word means. Um, the meaning of words comes from their usage. And Islamophobia, incidentally, is a curious expression. In one way, it was reintroduced into public discourse in 1997 with the Runnymede Report. And what is interesting about the Runnymede Report is that in 1996 they had published a report on anti-Semitism, and many of the people involved in that report on anti-Semitism then went on to write the report on Islamophobia in 1997. What they hadn't done at that time is look into how old that word was in terms of where it emerges. And a colleague of mine, Abdul Karim Vakil, has done a lot of work on this simply as a way of mapping out the fact that it, in many ways, the first time a similar word is used is like Islamophobia, and it's 1857, which technically makes it the oldest of these expressions. It's older than anti-Semitism and older than racism, for example. Then there is more kind of specific things like Islamophobia, which is probably the turn of the 20th century, etc. But what this map tells us is A, that there was something circulating around, so it's not completely a neologism. It was trying to address a problem, but what it doesn't tell us is that it can simply be reduced to the elements that constitute its name, because either phobia or Islam had very different connotations at different times.
And that's something in what you've said there, you've sort of anticipated or maybe responded to a number of different critiques of the term Islamophobia, right? I mean, this is something people say very often. They say, well, phobia in ancient Greek means irrational fear. And so Islamophobia is not a useful term because it would just mean an irrational fear of Muslims or of Islam itself. And I think more often people say that precisely because they don't particularly want Islamophobia to be stopped. So they say it as a way of making Islamophobia seem like it's something that you can't help perpetuating in the world, right? If it's just an irrational fear. And as you rightly say, the idea that phobia should be restricted to one of the great number of things that it may have meant, across various centuries in ancient Greek is a kind of silly over-reliance on etymology, when in fact we use this word phobia in loads of words all the time, right? We use it in homophobia, for example, we use it in xenophobia, where it doesn't mean irrational fear, right? It means this idea of prejudice, discrimination, all these kinds of concepts.
Or you could actually say, some people would argue, of course, it means irrational fear because it's irrational to be against people who carry out same-sex practices, for example. So the issue then becomes one of justification. But you're absolutely right. We use that in ordinary language, and it's not. No one says, well, we shouldn't use the word xenophobia. And the debate becomes is trying to, let's say, mitigate against the effects of homophobia or xenophobia, rather than saying, well, we need to get rid of those words because they're stopping us from doing other things. So I think one of the things about Islamophobia is that it remains incredibly contested, but in that contestation is actually one of the most important signifiers of Islamophobia itself. When you cannot even name it, that is showing you what Islamophobia is, as well as anything else.
Yeah, and that work that you've just identified of shifting from the endless circular conversations about appropriate terminology to actually doing some work to stop this thing as it makes its way, relatively murderously at the moment around the world, that shift from the conversation about terminology to the conversation about how do we stop Islamophobia is work that you have been part of, or at least one of the pieces of work that you were part of in order to make that shift was, of course, the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia, which you were there making reference to, I think, in your first response, where you said a straightforward way to think about Islamophobia is as a kind of racism, right? And the all-party parliamentary group definition, if I'm citing it correctly, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm not, is Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and what it was hoped that defining the term might allow us to do?
Well, I think you're being very generous about saying what contribution we actually made to getting rid of Islamophobia. At least we tried, but that's the only thing I would say.
Yeah,
I don't
I
think
don't
in
think
terms
you've
of
managed it yet.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a work. It's still on the to-do list, I think.
Yeah.
But I think it's more of a collaborative
Yeah.
effort anyway. I think what might be a good way to maybe give a little bit of background to how the whole process was. So, the all-party group on British Muslims decided that what they wanted was a report on an understanding of Islamophobia, which they thought could be distilled into a definition. And what they invited was many different actors, civil society actors, etc., to submit their ideas, what they might be. So I and Abdul Karim Vakil, who was the co-writer on this, decided that what we needed wasn't a legal definition as such, which goes into a paragraph or something like that, because most people don't actually use legal definitions most of the time. So if you think about uh, any kind of activity or behavior, um, let's say, take for example, racism. Most people on this call will not have a legal definition of racism per se, but they kind of know when they see it because we've moved to a kind of a cultural understanding of how things work. Take, for example, sexism. If you watch films of the 1970s in Britain or sitcoms of 1970s, and you think, oh, well, this is actually completely, we understand why it's misogynist now, but we probably didn't understand why it was misogynist then. But we can understand it. We don't have to have a particular legal definition of it, but we kind of get it's not right. It doesn't sit with us. So that was the first kind of thing, is that what we're trying to do is actually have a way in which Islamophobia began to circulate in society, in the general culture, in the same way that racism and sexism and homophobia circulate, that people become aware of it and they can point it out without necessarily being very, very clear about the legal status of something. And there were two reasons for this. One, we're very, very aware that juries and judges and lawyers are also part of society. So unless they have an understanding of a cultural understanding of particular kinds of behavior, they cannot come to conclusions which are really outside the cultural understanding, whatever the law may say. And we've seen this, for example, in questions about sexual violence and sexual assault. Often you had judges who would actually blame those who were subjugated to those assaults for inviting them simply because that was their understanding of how these things work. And until that changed, you were not going to get whatever laws you could put in, it would not actually change practices or conduct behavior. So there is educational work that needs to be done to win the argument in the culture before you can actually have legal framework. So that was our first kind of thing. The second element was this, that it was also a political calculation that this APG was working at the time of the very right-wing Tory government still, and it was unlikely, given the kind of makeup of this government and many of their kind of neocon principles in both uses of the term, that they would take this up anyway. So the argument for us was that we wanted something which was like one sentence, that, or at least you could put on a T-shirt, and that you could actually have, 10-year-olds being able to say, okay, we understand this and we get this, and we can then call it out and we can be mobilized around this, and we can see this in the classroom or we can see this in the street, etc., rather than having a very convoluted definition. So for that reason, we wanted something very, very short, and what we expected was that the APG would then use that as a way of actually carrying out a campaign of education around that term. So our kind of conclusion was simply that, would be that Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness. So and the reason why we said expressions of Muslimness is that we were very aware that Islamophobes do not have a very acute theological understanding of who or who is not a Muslim. As you know, I've cited this very often. One of the first victims of the violence after 9/11 was Balbar Singh Sodhi, a Sikh man who was, I think, owned a gas station in Arizona, and he was shot by a racist because he wore a turban and he had a beard and and those were the markers. So, in a sense, Muslimness, and I think this is where it works, that often it's not a fixed question about how many do you say your prayers 5 times a day, or do you keep fast, etc., etc. No one knows that. That's not what you're attacked for. It is for the traces of Muslimness in a way. Yeah, and we've had many incidences. You know, the Brazilian Mendes, who was shot by the police for jumping over a turnstile because he was late for an interview, etc. Again, in this sort of free program, in that atmosphere, you can see that. So our idea was this: that it should be a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness. When it got to the APG, there was a kind of, which we probably were like naive about, a certain kind of contestation about who was going to have the definition, which grouping, what MPs were going to put into it, etc., etc. So you had this kind of almost kind of a little conflict around what the definition would be, etc., which is again normal political practice and etc. So the APG definition emerges from that conference. So they took what we had and then they added to it, and they became that and a definition, because one of the things we wanted to understand is, again, if you are working in a large organization in this country, nearly all large organizations have some kind of HR with some kind of anti-racist protocols. You can go to them, and they may or may not be effective, but if you go to your line manager and say you are suffering racism, they're not going to think, well, I don't know what to do. There will be some protocols to say, okay, I can put this together. If you tell them that this is something suffering from Abu Lahabism, they might even offer you some aspirins or go and see a doctor or something like that, whatever the alternative may be, right? So I think it's very important that it builds on what was already existing to actually make the point that what we're dealing with is discriminatory practices, which are unjust in their own right, but we have had 50 years of struggle in trying to mitigate against these types of injustices. So I guess that's the long way of saying about it. So the APG then of course there was an election and there was a change in the APG, etc., and these things happen. But the purpose of the definition was really to change the culture and help support civil society and other organizations who want to do the right thing without actually having them involved in a much more root and branch transformation of processes and things like that, which we thought politically would just get bogged down.
And I've heard it referred to as the people's definition or a people's definition. So very much that idea of not necessarily giving some kind of complex legal definition, but having something that can be understood by, you know, a majority of people. And there's something else I think that calling it a type of racism does, which is that it builds on, as you say, a lot of the learning that societally we've done about racism, but not just in terms of how many people now can understand that something is racist, although I agree with you, that's an important part of it. For me, it also seems like it builds on our increased understanding of what racism actually is. I think something else that seems to have changed, you know, over the last decade is that many more people are now able to understand that racism is not just when someone uses a word that is offensive to you or assaults you on the street or something like that. In other words, it's not just interpersonal, it's also something that exists within structures, right? It's also something that affects things like employment, like education, like access to housing, medical care, you know, all of these different kind of aspects of society. Was wanting to make that structural point about Islamophobia, was that part of the point of making that connection with racism too?
Absolutely. And I think it was a critical point because one of the things about Islamophobia, like all types of racism, there was a sense that racism was something done by thugs. It's something
Mm,
that happened on the street, someone shouted at you, et cetera, et cetera. The institutional aspect, which is in many ways probably more debilitating um, for a larger number of people, was completely missed. So,
mm,
for example, we've seen experiments and studies done where identical CVs are sent to employers. The only marker is a difference in name. It could be, Fatima Jamil versus Susan Banks or something like that, just making up this name. And we've seen over time which of those identical CVs get called into an interview when there's no kind of indication. We know that there's institutional elements. We know in the higher education sector that many of us are involved in, there is something called the awarding gap,
mm,
where most universities have a situation that students of color who come with 3As, who may be expected, let's say, to finish in 3 years' time, 90% of them will get a first. If they're students of color, that may drop down to 60%. Why does that happen? Now, those sorts of factors, you will not know why this is happening because if you're an individual student of color, you will not necessarily know how your marks may be affected by this process because you think if you're not getting the marks, it may be to do with you, or et cetera, whatever. So the institutional element, which often becomes invisible, is really, really important. And we've moved the conversation to some extent in racism that people can understand racism in institutional terms because they can ask, well, why is it that we have so few, in terms of representation, for example, is one marker of represent institutional racism that you can look at the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of particular groups in particular positions um, in organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So the institutional aspect is really, really key rather than just and it's basically connecting both the institutional and the individualized element between the cold and the kind of hot
mm.
incidents of Islamophobia.
And being able to do that, being able to call it something structural or something institutional or something social, societal, whatever term we want to use, has also, I think, although I'm interested in whether you'd agree, has also, I think, allowed us to tell its history slightly differently. Because I think, many people, when they think about when they first became aware of Islamophobia, probably many people, and I'm making a big assumption, there's a large group of people here, so maybe people can tell me if they disagree, but probably most people would think of it as something that probably started with 9/11. That's kind of the one of the big moments at which the general public became aware of Islamophobia. But being able to identify it as something structural and something that has this relationship with racism that you've already explained also, I think, allows us to think a bit differently about that history. It allows us to think about the relationship between the colonial and Islamophobia, and to think about Islamophobia as a kind of system of governance that was also governing long before 9/11 colonized populations, many of whom were Muslim populations. I'm thinking, there are particular colonial powers for which that's especially true, right? I think France in particular is an example that interests me at the moment as a place that was able to use a lot of its colonial laws that it made for the control of colonized people in places like Algeria, was able to use them in France to control Muslim populations and restrict the lives of Muslim populations in France. So do you think that that's the case, that understanding it as something structural also allows us to see its relationship with coloniality?
I think understanding is a structural does two things. Firstly, it allows us to recover in racism the notion that racism isn't just about prejudices and particularly kind of pejorative comments that people may have in their heads, etc. That
Mm,
racism is a type of governance, and therefore, it's an interesting kind of argument that why we have two words to describe something very similar or something the same, for example, colonialism and racism.
mhm,
And the first use of racism is in German, and it's in the 1930s to describe what the Nazis are doing in Germany. But in the 1930s, what the Nazis are doing in Germany is exactly what the French are doing in their empire, what the British are doing in their empire, what the Dutch are doing in their empire, what the United States is doing in most of its territories. So it's not a strange kind of phenomenon. So the question really is why we have the word racism rather than colonialism. And you know, the argument in a way, and this is the argument that Cesar made that in writing in just after the Second World War, that really part of what one way of understanding National Socialism was the idea of imperialism brought to the heart of Europe itself, where it shouldn't have been. So, in a sense, the violence and the indignities which were possible as long as they stayed outside Europe became problematic once they were inside Europe. And that I think is an interesting kind of thing. So I think there's that link there, and also when you look at the earlier uses of that coinage as a term, like Muslim phobia, it's in 1857 by a British person working for the British Raj, coming up with this process. Look, this is what's happening now in relation to the attacks on Muslims who are being treated in a particular way. Again, in Islamophobia coming in, it's again the colonial context. These terms initially appear in the colonies to describe what we would describe colonies. What is interesting about 1997 and 1985, where Edward Said uses it in the second edition of his book Orientalism, but in 97 it appears actually in a colonial power rather than a colonized power. And in doing so, it generates something new. I think it's really, really important that we don't produce as year zero as 9/11. Even at a basic arithmetic, the Runnymede report came out in 1997. That's a few years before 9/11. And unless you are one of these kind of grand conspirators, which I'm sure that they already predicted 9/11, so they had it in place, etc. If people were that organized and capable of that far thinking, the world would be a much more interesting place, but they're not, and it isn't. So I think I'd rest that. So yeah, I think there is no doubt that the war on terror um, exasperated and intensified Islamophobia, but its conditional very possibility was Islamophobic from the get-go. And that had been happening even before 97, because 97, the report may have introduced the word, but they were actually responding to something that was already happening socially and culturally, and they were aware of it, and they were becoming aware of it.
So I want to knit together a few of the different threads that are coming out of here, because I also want to shift us to thinking a little bit about the relationship between Islamophobia and Palestine. And we've already talked here about the relationship between Islamophobia and colonialism or coloniality. We've already talked, you've mentioned India already. So, you know, when you mentioned, you know, that use of the term Islamophobia, it made me think immediately of not just the genocide of the Palestinians, but a number of different Islamophobic projects that we're seeing around the world at the moment. For instance, the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan by China, the persecution of Muslim minorities in India. And so it's almost like once we understand Islamophobia as having a relationship with colonialism, we begin to see a kind of world picture where we see a number of different instances of Islamophobia that, I mean, I say Islamophobia, we're really talking about, you know, attempts to eradicate or extremely strictly limit and control the lives of Muslims, right? Do you see Palestine as part of this project of global Islamophobia, or is what's going on there something different? In other words, a very simple way for me to put this question would be, what's the relationship between Islamophobia and Palestine? You're muted, I think.
I think the way I would start to answer this question, and it's a really important question, is twofold. One, why is it that white supremacists, pan chauvinists, advocates of Hindutva, Burmese nationalists, all express themselves through Islamophobia? through racism, which targets expressions of Muslimness. They may not agree on many other things, but they seem to agree on that. So that in itself tells you something about the place of Muslimness here. And you would include Zionists, ultra-Zionists in that argument as well, because there is something around the figure of the Muslim which is seen as an obstacle to the completion of national destiny. And in that regard, Palestine is both a test case for Islamophobia, because in many of those tropes which are used to justify the violence against the Palestinians has a very deep Islamophobic pedigree. It circulates through those kinds of mechanisms. And there is, of course, the fact that many of those involved in um, those actions against the Palestinian people in in the Gaza or in the West Bank are themselves often the same people who are involved in peddling Islamophobia. You can tell that by the demonstrations that take place, for example. When Tommy Robinson or his acolytes come up, what are the flags that they hold up there? Before Trump became legitimate in this election in January the 6th, if you look at the demonstrations, what were the flags over there? There's a US flag, there was a Confederate flag, and there were often Israeli flags. So there is a kind of a link between Islamophobia, both in terms of how that material circulates across these different places, the collaboration and cooperation between different security forces, different kinds of regimes of surveillance, different kinds of techniques, but also the idea that this is something that there's a particular technique for dealing with Muslims. Now, Edward Said, writing in the 70s and the 80s, comments upon this quite regularly, how there is a kind of the continuation of Orientalism is often sort of franchised away to Tel Aviv, that they are the experts on the Muslim mind or Muslim behavior and Muslim conduct. And we see these kind of linkages. They know how to deal with Muslims. Muslims cannot be trusted to do this. They cannot be trusted to do that, etc., etc. So all of these points do become condensed in there. And this is why it seems to me it's very difficult to be, you cannot oppose Islamophobia and support genocide. It seems to me that you have to, you have to sort of be some. If you are against Islamophobia, then you have to recognize it's global, but also see its intensifications in local, um, different ways that it presents itself, including right now as what is happening in Gaza. And the final point I would make, and this is a point that perhaps doesn't need to be made, but it's just sometimes so obvious that you kind of forget how obvious it is. Look at the way in which Ukrainian lives, are reported against how Palestinian lives are valued and reported. Or look at the example that there is an Institute of Higher Learning in London. Its department has in its entrance the Ukrainian flag. I'm not sure that there are many institutions of Middle Eastern studies that will have the Palestinian flag displayed on them, officially and formally. So these differences explain to us both. Now, when we see these differences, we're very used to, we should be used to saying, well, here is racism operating institutionally. And therefore, if you think of Islamophobia in similar terms, when you see those differences, you can see that these are questions of which are operating through those markers.
And when you began your response there, you said that Muslims are, in a sense, working against ideas of, or the completion of national projects, I think you said. And what we're really talking about here is, is the project of ethno-nationalism, right? And it's just occurred to me as you were making the connection there with racism, that one of the ways to show the connection between Islamophobia and racism, or rather to show that Islamophobia is a type of racism, is to think about it in relation to this idea of ethno-nationalism, right? This idea that a land belongs to a people and has belonged to a people, a racialized people, since the beginning of time. That's the story that white supremacists tell about Europe, right? That Europe is a continent that is defined by its whiteness because at some primordial time that no one can really quite state, everyone was white and people of color, and particularly Muslims, are kind of latecomers to that narrative. And that's the same narrative we're hearing about Palestine, right? That Palestine, that Muslims, Palestinians are latecomers to the history of Palestine. So they're both those racist discourses, Islamophobic discourses, are plugged into this kind of same idea, I guess, of ethno-nationalism. But I'm wondering, somebody might say in response to that, in response to us wanting to unpick that big narrative of history where, the Islamophobic narrative of history, which is that Muslims come late to the history of the world, somebody who was wanting to argue against, this idea that there's this special relationship between the genocide of the Palestinians and Islamophobia, somebody might say, oh, but Palestinians are not all Muslim. Right, there are Christian Palestinians who have also been victims of Israel's violence against Palestinians. How would you respond to something like that?
But I mean, like, this is why I think I would focus on Muslimness rather than Muslim, because Sikhs are not Muslims either. The point is that, yes, you're right. Something like, I think something like 20% I heard of Palestinians are Christian. There may be many Palestinians who are atheists, but that's not they're not read through that. And they are read through a kind of a Muslimness, which doesn't mean that you have to be a Muslim. Again, the question of who is a Muslim, you get a handful of Muslims sitting around, and they probably can't agree on whether any of them are Muslims. I mean, again, it's not. It works differently. So I think the key here is this: is not about whether someone is a Muslim or not Muslim, whether someone's an atheist or a believer. Question is a category of Muslimness. And right now, for very, very contingent and historical reasons, there is a conflation between Palestinianism and being a Muslim. And that is consistent. Now, that may not always be the case. It may become different another time. We don't know. But right now, one of the markers of Muslimness is support for the Palestinian people. Now, that doesn't mean that every single Muslim supports them, but if you start a conversation, most times you'll find that, there is some sort of, there's a family resemblance around the support of Palestinians, in the same way that there's a family resemblance between those who are Islamophobes and those who support the oppression of the Palestinians. Now, it doesn't mean that every single person who's a neocon or every person, who's a chauvinist supports is exact. I think there's a need to be, but there's a sufficient kind of body of opinion that allows us to say with some confidence that there is easy to conflate the two.
And I wonder whether that has an effect, and this will be my last question before we open up to questions from the audience. I wonder whether that has an effect, or the kind of Muslimization of pro-Palestinianism that you're describing, I wonder whether that has an effect on some of the ways that pro-Palestinianism is treated and policed and criminalized. And I'm thinking of, the name of this webinar is Islamophobia and the Palestine exception. The Palestine exception there, of course, referring to the idea that Palestine is in a sense the exception to rights to freedom of speech and academic freedom. So this idea that you can be criminalized for pro-Palestinianism, even if the sorts of things you're saying would not be criminalizable if you said them out, some other kind of cause. That Palestine is in a sense a special case for free speech, for rights of free speech and of academic freedom. So I'm wondering whether that is actually tied up with the point you've just made, which is that this almost seems like a cause that reflects a certain Muslimness, even though, you know, as you've said, it's certainly not a cause that every single Muslim in the world would support, although it does have wide support among Muslims. It's also a cause that is supported, you know, by large numbers of Jewish pro-Palestinians, of atheist pro-Palestinians. I mean, it's certainly not only a Muslim cause, but it does seem to have become, in a sense, rhetorically speaking, a cause that is attached to Muslimness. Is that partly what explains this thing about the Palestine exception, do you think? You're muted, I think, somewhere.
I think there are two elements to this. Firstly, if you look at, again, Ukraine, and you have a conflict in which Muslimness isn't operating in relation to the two parties to that conflict, right? And you can see what can be said, what cannot be said, etc., how certain provisions are possible to be made. Now, I would argue that the conflict in Gaza, part of it is resting on a framework of Islamophobia, not just in terms of the kind of linguistic elements that we talked about, but institutional Islamophobia, which has been enacted through various policies, including Prevent, including before that the policies around combating violent extremism, etc. Without those policies and protocols and procedures, which transform not just state institutions, but also how the conversation of the nation takes place, many of those things, of the silencing of Palestinian voices, would not have been possible. And so it already occurs in that milieu. So that's the first element I would want to say about that. I think you're absolutely right that the Palestinian cause is a cause that many people of good faith and justice have it. It isn't a cause which is simply a Muslim cause. What is interesting is, let's look at, for example, Jewish supporters of the Palestinian cause, how they are written out of that narrative. In terms of both pronouncements of these, for example, the demonstrations are deemed to be anti-Jewish and no Jewish persons there and all Jewish people feel unsafe, etc., while there has been a significant contingent of Jewish people who declare themselves to be Jewish, who are involved in supporting and freeing the freedom of Palestine. Now, they are completely obliterated from that picture, whether they're in Toronto or they're in London. That's what happens. And what happens in a way is that the Palestinian cause is become a marker of Muslimness that is seen in those terms, and that's how people respond to it. So they basically mobilize the circulation of Islamophobic means, which have been deployed for a while now, institutionally, etc. They use the same kind of, often using the legislative framework, which is Islamophobic in its attempt, or the regulatory framework, which is not the legislative framework necessarily, to curtail, being able to speak or champion on issues of Palestine. So when you see that, it's almost impossible to imagine the way in which the representation of the current round of struggles, and I would probably go back earlier than that, is almost impossible without that bedrock of Islamophobia, which has been institutionalized in cultural practices, media organizations, other kind of public bodies, as well as large civil bodies. So, people forget that the after Orientalism, Edward Said wrote Covering Islam, which talked about some of these issues. He also wrote a book called Question of Palestine, in which he actually navigated these kinds of moves around Orientalism, the use of Orientalism, the use of Islamophobia, to regulate and discipline how Palestinian voices could be heard or presented.
Yeah, and that almost in a sense takes us all the way back to the question of definitions, right? Because one of the things we've seen in the pro-Palestine movement have been, Jewish colleagues who have been caught between definitions of anti-Semitism, because they've been caught between, that example in the IHRA definition about criticism of the so-called state of Israel, being in itself anti-Semitic. So we've seen, particularly Jewish colleagues, pro-Palestinian Jewish colleagues, kind of caught between what anti-Semitism means between different definitions.
I think it's important to mention that the IHR definition is not the issue. It's the actual examples which
Yeah.
make the case that criticism of Israel is in itself anti-Semitic,
Yeah.
which, if you were being perverse, would argue is one of the most anti-Semitic statements ever made, because what it does is reduce Jewish experiences completely to the activities of one state. That's what it does. And, there's a whole mismatch between, you could argue about what happens to many, many Jews who were against the foundation or against the Zionist project, continue to be against the Zionist project. Do they stop being Jews, etc.? So I think this is it is important to maintain that distinction. But you're absolutely right. The definition, now we have a situation that what is anti-Semitic is being determined often by anti-Semites.
Yeah.
Both historically and contemporarily. So we'd have to take lessons from anti-Semites on what anti-Semitism is, in the same way we have to take lessons from racists what racism is.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it creates certain amounts of tension. And this is why I think the final thing I want to, well, not the final thing, but one thing I want to say about that, we should understand the conceptualization of Islamophobia is a tool for carrying out justice. It is that is all that it is. It has a purpose, and the purpose is to be used as a lever to ensure justice for a segment of the population in which there's a deficit around this particular issue. It's not a magic wand that gets rid of all the evils of the world. It's simply a tool for a particular purpose. And that purpose should be something we can all agree on, and that is that a segment of the population, their experiences, their opportunities are interdicted by the existence of Islamophobia, and their ability to participate in society is interdicted by the existence of Islamophobia. Therefore, in a way, if you believe in if you believe in a society which is going to be much more inclusive and cohesive, etc., you must be against Islamophobia.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I feel like I should stop talking for a moment and we should open up to some of the questions that no doubt people in the audience have. The way that you ask a question, I think Farnaz did say at the beginning, but just to remind you, the way you ask a question is by using the Q&A box. And can I ask that we use the Q&A box for asking questions of the speaker rather than for having conversations with each other? That means that we have a kind of more streamlined Q&A box and we can more easily read the questions in it. So please, feel free to put your questions in the box. There's no such thing as a silly question. All questions are welcomed. I have a first question here, someone that says, can Professor Sayed please speak to the issue of the Palestine exception in relation to decolonization initiatives, especially those claimed to be underway in the academy? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things one could say is that it's been very odd how decolonizing initiatives seem to have, I wouldn't say necessarily petered out, but lost a lot of their energy when it became the case that should we be not talking about decolonization in relation to what's happening in Palestine, in terms of decolonization, even in terms of the struggle in against forms of apartheid. Now, I think to be fair to the institutions, many of those who were advocating decolonization and decolonizing curriculum, etc., have not also been very forthcoming around this issue. And again, some of them have said, well, we don't know enough about it to make a comment, etc. We need to understand that the suffering of the Palestinian people is due to extremist groups, etc., etc. So there's all of that. So I think the issue is this, that we've seen, what I would argue is that there's been a kind of a decolonial talk, which is kind of the public understanding of decolonization, which universities and other public organizations have been very, very keen, I would say, to do mea culpas for the past sins, whether it's colonialism or in slavery, etc. they seem less aware or willing to take on contemporary challenges which they can actually do. And I think this is a serious problem, and this is why, so I don't know. The Palestinian exception manifests itself precisely because the public kind of circulation of decoloniality in particular places has raised the expectations, and the disappointment is far greater. And it's also interesting that even now, that many of the demonstrations that we have are actually asked for decolonization as one of the kind of key slogans that often appears. So there's both a recognition of an incomplete decolonization, which I suppose is an apt metaphor for the world where we are, a world where there's been an incomplete process of decolonization.
I think that's so important. The very convenient impetus to see the colonial as something that happened in the past and is not ongoing. But there are more questions, so I'm going to be quiet and push on. There's a question here that says, could you please comment on the phenomenon of philo-Semitism or Semitophilia? This person can't decide which of those terms to use, but philo-Semitism or Semitophilia, and how it relates to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
I mean, one of the key things is this, okay? We've always understood about racism is the fact that it manifests itself in many different kinds of modalities. Often people would say, if you're making a positive statement about a group of people, oh, it can't be racist because it's positive. Um, and the thing is that so often the phobia and the philo and the phobia are part of the same spectrum. To say that a particular population is good at X because of their specific traits may seem like, oh, this is a positive statement, but it is simply as racist as any other statement. So the question about the philo-Semitism, a lot of people who use philo-Semitism are basically have a very anti-Semitic conception of what the figure of the Jew is, what it means to be Jewish, etc., and Jewish history. So in a way that it becomes this thing about these are positive metaphors that we attach to Jewish people and Jewish experiences, but these positive elements that we attach simply are not that different from the history of anti-Semitism, which attaches similar types of descriptors, but revalorizes them in slightly different ways. So I think what I would say to you is that philo-Semitism is simply is another aspect of anti-Semitism.
I'm thinking about how that might relate also to the numbers of young men in particular who revert to Islam at a certain point in their life. So they have a very positive association with Islam, but that positive association for particular men, of course, not all men who revert to Islam are in this position, but that positive association comes from the fact that they believe that Muslims treat women in incredibly misogynistic ways. So they essentially have an Orientalist vision of what it means to be Muslim, that they're in fact incredibly in love with that vision, right? It's an extremely positive relationship for them, except it's a relationship with a sort of Orientalist mirage of Muslim misogyny in particular.
No, I think you put that really well. I mean, there are many, many people who are attracted to Islam, whether they revert or don't revert, they find in it a refuge from modernity, and
Yeah.
that's how they express it. And for them, women know their place. That's part of it. Things are certain. There's no debate, etc., etc. These are Orientalist caricatures, and it says more about their own kind of fantasies, which they project onto the surface of Muslims. Um, and Muslims don't have any particular need to be involved in that, in those fantasies.
Yeah. So Roxana would like to know about the future. She asks you, what do you think the future holds for Muslims in the Middle East now that Trump is appointing an ultra-Zionist administration?
I think we should stop confusing academics with astrology. I think the future is what we make of it. In a sense that when people say the future written, well, that's good enough for God, but not for us. So I think there are clearly, it is, people are, and rightly so, very concerned given the neocon cabal that Trump too has. I mean, I think we can make Trump one was neither a neocon, he was just chaotic. It seems that there is an argument for saying that Trump too has been hijacked or willingly surrendered to neocon people. You can see that in terms of the distribution of offices and various kind of projects. But at the same time, I would say to you, one of the issues has been that Trump, one, helped ignite a greater degree of resistance and advocacy in grassroots work. Some of you may remember the images on John F. K, where there was people, ordinary passengers making space to allow Muslims to pray at the airport after the Muslim ban, etc.
Yeah.
I would put it to you, if Biden or Harris had instituted the Muslim ban, and remember Obama was the one who instituted the legislation for the Muslim ban, you would not have got that, perhaps you would not have got the same kind of reaction. So I think one of the things is this, that it also gives a choice for not just Muslims in the Middle East, wherever that may be, but Muslims everywhere. How do they get involved? How do they engage? And now there is no excuses. We cannot depend on others. We know what this situation is. We know what we need to do, what needs to be done, what the struggle is. If you know those things are clear, then you have a duty to do whatever you can rather than wait for something else to be done for it. So I think the future is a future that we need to educate ourselves to learn how to carry out the struggle for justice um, all across the board.
Mm. And in a way, I apologize for drawing on the example of France again. I'm a real geek, it turns out, of French Islamophobia at the moment. But we're already seeing that process that you're describing happening in France, right? We've seen in France recently this whole list of persecutions, criminalizations of pro-Palestinian Muslim voices in particular. And what the backlash has been to that is extremely large numbers of Muslims, but not only Muslims, suddenly realizing that political involvement, protest action, political action, being involved, being organized is a thing that is no longer a choice. It's something that has become much more a part of their lives. And also, I think really interestingly, part of their identity as Muslims. They've seen Muslims be criticized for their pro-Palestinian views, or not even criticized, right? Persecuted by the legal system for their pro-Palestinian views, and they have done this kind of switch in themselves of thinking, oh, okay, so that pro-Palestinianism is actually part of what it means to be Muslim, this kind of solidarity, transnational solidarity, what we might call the ummah, right? These things are much more visibly part of Muslim identity than perhaps they were before there was this very recent kind of expanding of persecution.
I think what you said is really, really important. And I think part of it is, look, how many people on this call would know about what's happening to the Uyghurs? How many people now look back and see what happened to the Rohingya became almost a lower the threshold of what kind of violence was possible for Muslims to be done to Muslims? What is happening in France in many ways is really, really more dangerous to Muslimness than anywhere else, partly because if a so-called established liberal democratic country, one of these Western plutocracies, can carry out these kinds of measures without challenge and without comment, then there is no place which is safe for Muslimness. So, and again, how many Muslims in this country are able to talk to, write to their MP or do whatever they can, awareness of that situation. So part of the question was what the future is. And I think the future must be that we must become far more aware of Islamophobia, both in its intensity and its global range. And rather than worrying too much about being precise about where it's occurring or not, understand that this is part of a broader family, and what is happening in Germany, what is happening in France, what is happening in Austria will have direct implications of what is possible for it to happen elsewhere. And I imagine that if you were one of these kind of Islamophobic hawks, chicken hawks sitting uh, in Mar-a-Lago right now, you would think, well, if France could do this, we can try and do this in the US. So it becomes a perpetuating machinery of a global institution of Islamophobia. And if you're a person of goodwill, you must resist the institution of global Islamophobia. Because if that happens, it doesn't just affect Muslims, as we've already seen, it actually affects all of us because it takes away our ability to hold those who have power accountable. It takes away our ability to have a degree of sovereignty for civil society itself. It rewrites the social contract between the rulers and the ruled. And this is being done so on the body of Muslims because the idea is that, well, if we do it on Muslims, they'll know. But the fine print of the contract will affect everybody.
Mm-hmm. So the future is resistance, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Right. I think we had better finish there. We haven't unfortunately managed to answer everyone's questions, so I'm sorry about that. But thank you. I'm going to pass back to you, Farnaz, in just a second. But let me just on all of our behalf, Salman, say thank you so much for coming to talk to us. Thank you for your time, and thanks to everyone also for coming to listen. Farnaz.
Thank you. Thank you to both speakers, Chela Ward and Salman Said, for sharing your expertise on the topic of Islamophobia and the Palestine exception. Thank you also to all of you that attended today. Please do check out the OU Palestine Solidarity channel on YouTube for our previous webinars as well. But thank you all very much for attending.